My wife came home from work today with an unusual spark in her eyes. She looked like a kid who just got the toy they had always wanted, and I could already tell she had something planned. Without hesitation, she showed me 2 tickets and said her friend had gifted them to her. Apparently, the tickets were for an art gallery, and not just any gallery, it was some modern art exhibition by her friend's close acquaintance. Now, I'll be honest, art, especially modern art, has never been my cup of tea. The whole banana taped to a wall for $100,000 type of thing just makes me shake my head. But this was important to my wife, and more importantly, it was free, and it's hard to turn down a gift, especially one that makes her this excited. After a brief pause, I figured it wouldn't hurt to give it a shot. At the very least, it would be a change of pace from my usual routine, and I could stretch my legs while spending some quality time with her. So, I said, "All right, let's do it." But there was still something nagging at me. Who exactly was behind this exhibition? What kind of art would we be looking at? If it was something more sophisticated, I could probably tolerate it, but if it was just a bunch of splashes of paint on a canvas, I wasn't sure I'd be able to take it seriously. I asked her to give her friend a call and get a bit more information so that I could prepare myself mentally. She did just that. I watched her chat with her friend, and it sounded like they were both pretty enthusiastic about the event. My wife looked at me, her face still glowing with excitement, and said that the exhibition would showcase work from a number of emerging artists. There would be a mix of different types of art, something for everyone, apparently. I could hear her friend on the other end saying that it would be an unforgettable experience. Well, if it was that good, maybe it wouldn't be such a waste of time. Besides, it's not every day that we go out to galleries, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to indulge her this once. As I stood there listening, I couldn't help but think about the whole concept of modern art. I knew it wasn't fair to dismiss it entirely, different strokes for different folks, as they say. But I was still skeptical. I mean, how can anyone call a single-colored canvas art? Yet, I wasn't about to say anything negative to my wife, not when she was this happy about the outing. It was clear that this was something she genuinely wanted to do, and if it made her happy, then I would go along with it. Sometimes it's not about understanding or even enjoying the experience yourself, it's about making sure the person you care about has the time of their life. Eventually, my skepticism started to fade. I figured that even if I didn't enjoy the art, I could at least enjoy the evening out with her. We'd have the chance to dress up, go somewhere new, and spend time together. We hadn't done that in a while, with our busy schedules and all. And I knew that it meant a lot to her that I was willing to step out of my comfort zone for once. She always made an effort to do things that I liked, even if they weren't her favorite. The least I could do was reciprocate. Plus, the idea of being able to analyze some weird pieces and have a laugh or two about them was starting to sound like fun. After getting all the details from her friend, my wife finally hung up the phone. She looked at me expectantly, her eyes still shining with excitement. I nodded and said, "All right, let's make it happen." She immediately grinned, and we started talking about our plans for tomorrow evening. I asked if we needed to dress up or if it was more of a casual affair, and she shrugged, saying it was somewhere in between. We decided we'd figure that part out tomorrow. For now, we were set. We'd head out together, see some art, and maybe even have a nice dinner afterward. It was settled, tomorrow evening, we'd be at the gallery, exploring whatever surprises modern art had in store for us. We arrived at the gallery the next evening, and to my surprise, it was packed. Despite it being an exhibition for emerging artists, there were people everywhere, couples, groups of friends, older folks, even a few kids tugging at their parents' hands. It was definitely more crowded than I had anticipated, and I found myself feeling a bit overwhelmed by the noise and the movement. But I kept my focus on my wife, who seemed genuinely thrilled to be there. We started walking through the different rooms, taking in all the art. As expected, the pieces on display weren't exactly my taste. A few of them looked like something a child could have drawn, and some were downright nonsensical, random colors splashed across a canvas without any rhyme or reason. But I kept my thoughts to myself, giving her the chance to enjoy the experience as much as possible. As we continued to make our way through the gallery, my wife's friend, who had given us the tickets, suddenly lit up like a Christmas tree. She let out an excited squeal and darted across the room, calling out to someone. My wife and I exchanged a quick glance before following her. Turns out, she was running over to greet a woman who turned out to be the owner of this gallery. I shook hands with her and offered a polite smile. She was dressed in a sharp, black business dress that made her look like she had just stepped off a fashion runway. Standing beside her was her husband, who was, well, an interesting sight. He wore a beanie, a hoodie, and cropped pants, a look that screamed artist, but definitely contrasted with his wife's polished appearance. The two of them together were like night and day, and it was hard not to notice the stark difference. After introductions were made, we all continued walking through the gallery. My wife's friend got caught up in conversation with the owner, talking about the gallery, the pieces on display, and some mutual acquaintances. Meanwhile, her husband started tagging along with my wife and me. He seemed friendly enough at first, but it didn't take long before I began to notice that he was paying a little too much attention to my wife. It wasn't just a casual interest, he was practically glued to her side, and his eyes hardly left her. I tried to keep my cool, but it was getting under my skin. Then, out of nowhere, he made a comment that crossed the line. He said something about my wife having an amazing face and figure and mentioned that he wanted to paint her naked. I stopped in my tracks and gave him a hard look, telling him to watch his mouth. He laughed it off, saying it was just a joke, but I wasn't amused. My wife, for her part, seemed completely oblivious to the whole exchange. She was still focused on the artwork, commenting on the pieces she liked and pointing out the ones she found interesting. I could tell she was genuinely enjoying herself, and I didn't want to ruin the evening for her by making a scene. So, I decided to let it go, for now at least. But it left a bad taste in my mouth, and I kept an eye on the guy as we moved through the rest of the gallery. He kept trying to make conversation, throwing in random comments and jokes, most of which I ignored. My patience was wearing thin, but I kept reminding myself that this night wasn't about me, it was about my wife and making sure she had a good time. Eventually, the gallery visit came to an end, and my wife suggested we all go grab a drink at a nearby bar. The gallery owner and her husband agreed, and so did my wife's friend. I wasn't particularly in the mood to spend more time with the guy who had just made an inappropriate comment about my wife, but I figured it was better to keep an eye on him than to let things get out of hand. So, we all headed over to the bar, found a table, and ordered some drinks. The artist husband kept talking, trying to be the center of attention, sharing stories about his artistic process, and some of his past projects. I couldn't care less, but my wife seemed entertained, and I wasn't about to spoil her mood. The rest of the evening went by in much the same way. We had a few drinks, and the guy kept running his mouth, clearly trying to impress everyone. It was almost pathetic how hard he was trying, and I couldn't help but wonder what his wife thought of all this. She seemed polite enough, but I noticed that she mostly stayed quiet, just nodding along to whatever he was saying. My wife's friend, on the other hand, was eating it all up, laughing at his jokes and encouraging him to keep talking. I stayed mostly silent, chiming in only when absolutely necessary, and focused on finishing my drink. Eventually, the conversation started to wind down, and it was clear that everyone was ready to call it a night. We said our goodbyes, exchanged pleasantries, and finally headed home. The next morning, as we were having our coffee, I decided to bring up what had happened the previous night. It had been bothering me since we left the gallery, and I couldn't just ignore it any longer. I asked my wife if she didn't find it strange how that guy, the gallery owner's husband, was behaving. To me, everything about him seemed off. First of all, he looked nothing like someone who would be married to a woman like her. She was so polished, elegant, and put together, while he looked like he was auditioning for some street gang. The guy looked like he could be her son, for crying out loud. My wife frowned and told me not to call him names, that we shouldn't judge people by their appearance. I sighed, not wanting to start an argument so early in the morning, but I had to get my point across. I reminded her of what he had said about painting her nude. I asked her if she really thought that was appropriate, especially considering how he had said it so casually, as if it was a normal thing to suggest. She shrugged, saying that he was an artist and that's just how artists are sometimes. That answer didn't sit well with me. It felt like she was dismissing my concerns, and I didn't like that one bit. Sure, he might be an artist, but there's a line between being eccentric and being flat-out disrespectful. The way he had been staring at her, the way he had made that comment, it was all too much, and I wasn't about to pretend like it didn't happen. I made it clear to her that I didn't like the guy and that something about him just rubbed me the wrong way. My wife gave me a small smile, almost like she found my reaction amusing. Then she dropped the bombshell. She said, "Well, if you don't like him, I've got some bad news for you." I raised an eyebrow, and she went on to explain that during their conversation last night, she and the gallery owner had realized that they went to the same university, albeit in different groups. It had been an unexpected connection, and they ended up reminiscing about old times. By the end of it, my wife had invited them over for a barbecue at our place. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything that had happened, she had actually invited them to our home? The very idea made my blood boil, but I tried my best to stay calm and not overreact. She continued, explaining that she thought it would be a nice opportunity for everyone to get to know each other better. She mentioned that the gallery owner was excited to catch up, and that they both thought it would be a fun way to spend some time together, especially since we all had such busy schedules. I could feel the tension building in my chest as she spoke. It wasn't that I was against meeting new people or socializing, but I had a real problem with that guy. There was just something about him that I couldn't shake, an instinct that told me he wasn't someone I wanted around my wife. But I also knew that this meant a lot to her, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin her plans. So, I took a deep breath and tried to keep my emotions in check. I told her that I still wasn't thrilled about the idea, but if it was important to her, then I would go along with it. She smiled again, and I could tell that she appreciated my willingness to compromise. She said that it would just be a casual barbecue, nothing fancy, and that we could all relax and enjoy ourselves. I nodded, though I still felt uneasy about the whole thing. I wasn't about to let my guard down, especially not around that guy. I would make sure to keep an eye on him, and if he crossed the line again, there wouldn't be any joking around, I would set him straight. My wife seemed satisfied with my response, and we went back to our morning routine, though the thought of that upcoming barbecue stayed in the back of my mind. As we finished our breakfast, I couldn't help but wonder what I was getting myself into. It was clear that my wife genuinely wanted to reconnect with the gallery owner, and I wasn't about to stand in the way of that. But I also knew that I would need to be on high alert to make sure that nothing inappropriate happened again. I wasn't going to let that guy get too comfortable or think that he could say whatever he wanted without consequences. If he was going to be in my home, he needed to know that there were boundaries, and I wasn't afraid to enforce them. I resolved to make the best of the situation, for my wife's sake, but I would be keeping a close eye on everything that happened. Just as we were getting ready to start our day, my wife turned to me and said, "Oh, and make sure you're ready for the barbecue. I want everything to go smoothly." I nodded, though a part of me was still bracing for whatever might happen. I knew I had to be prepared, not just for the barbecue itself, but for anything that might come up once those two walked through our door. It was clear that my wife wanted this to be a positive experience, and I wasn't about to let her down, but I also wasn't going to let my guard down, not for a second. She smiled at me, and with that, we both went on with our day, knowing that soon enough, we'd be hosting a barbecue that was bound to be anything but ordinary. When it came time to prepare for the barbecue, I made sure that everything was going to be top-notch. I wanted to make the best possible impression, not only for my wife's sake but also to show that guy that this was my home, and I wasn't someone to be taken lightly. I went out and bought the best cuts of meat I could find, along with all the fixings. My father even came over to help with the preparations. He had his own special marinade recipe, and we worked together to get everything ready. As we stood there in the kitchen, I told my dad about the situation with the gallery owner and her husband. He listened carefully, then told me, "Son, sometimes you just need to put a man in his place. Women respect that. And from what you've told me, it sounds like the guy's wife runs the show, not him." Your job is to make a solid impression. It won't be easy, but it's worth it. I nodded, appreciating his advice, and felt even more determined to handle this barbecue with confidence. Once everything was ready, I packed up the supplies and headed home, where my wife and our guests were already starting to gather. The backyard was set up with chairs and tables, and there was a comfortable, laid-back atmosphere. I could hear laughter and conversation as I walked in, and I was glad that things seemed to be off to a good start. I greeted everyone, shook hands, and made small talk before heading over to the grill to get started on cooking. I took pride in how I handled the grill, making sure each piece of meat was cooked to perfection. It was my way of showing that I could provide and take care of those around me. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until the artist husband made an announcement that took us all by surprise. He casually mentioned that he was vegan and wouldn't be eating any of the meat. The comment caught me off guard, and I wasn't the only one. Even his wife seemed a bit surprised by the sudden declaration. I looked at him and then at the grill full of meat and told him, "Well, that's unfortunate because there's not much else here." He waved it off, saying it was no big deal and that he'd just stick to drinks. I shrugged and turned my attention back to the grill, but I couldn't help feeling like he was trying to make a statement or put me on the spot. Regardless, I wasn't about to let it bother me. I kept focused on what I was doing, making sure everyone else was enjoying themselves. As the afternoon went on, people continued to mingle, and the conversation flowed. The artist husband seemed to be trying to insert himself into every conversation, constantly making jokes and trying to keep the spotlight on himself. At one point, he asked where the restroom was, and my wife offered to show him the way. I watched them head inside, and something about it just didn't sit right with me. I decided to make the best of the situation, though, and struck up a conversation with the gallery owner. I asked her how she and her husband had met and how they had ended up opening the gallery. She seemed happy to talk about it, and I listened politely, though I kept glancing toward the house, wondering what was taking them so long. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it any longer, and I decided to go check on them. I motioned to the gallery owner to come with me, and we headed inside. We found my wife and her husband standing in the living room, looking at one of the paintings hanging on the wall. They were chatting about the painting, and my wife seemed to be explaining where we had gotten it. I cleared my throat to let them know we were there, and the artist husband finally excused himself to go to the restroom. I stayed in the living room with my wife and the gallery owner, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at me. After a few minutes, the guy came back out and said he had left his lighter and cigarettes outside. He headed back out, and I decided to follow him a few moments later, needing a smoke myself. When I stepped outside, I saw him standing by the side of the house, and to my surprise, he wasn't smoking. Instead, he was stuffing his face with one of the burgers that I had grilled. The same guy who had made such a big deal about being vegan was now hiding and eating meat like a guilty child. I couldn't help but laugh. It was almost too perfect, all that talk, and here he was, caught red-handed. I didn't say anything, just turned and walked back to the group. If he wanted to make a fool of himself, I wasn't going to stop him. I returned to the barbecue, and we all continued to chat, drink, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Eventually, the sun began to set, and people started to make their way home. We said our goodbyes, and I made sure to be polite and thank everyone for coming. The gallery owner and her husband were among the last to leave, and I shook the guy's hand, giving him a look that I hoped conveyed that I was onto him. He just smiled, acting as if nothing had happened. My wife seemed happy with how everything had gone, and I decided to leave things at that. Once everyone had finally left, I started cleaning up, feeling relieved that the barbecue was over and done with. It had been an eventful day, but I was glad to have my home back to ourselves. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, I couldn't help but bring up what I had seen earlier. I looked over at my wife and asked if she knew that our so-called vegan guest had been sneaking around eating a burger in secret. She let out a laugh, clearly amused, and said that he was probably just trying to make an impression in front of everyone by claiming he was vegan. It didn't surprise me, the guy seemed like the type who'd say or do anything to look a certain way. I shook my head, unable to understand why anyone would go through the trouble of pretending to be something they weren't. But that wasn't the only thing that had been on my mind, and I figured it was the right time to bring up the other part of the day that had bothered me. I asked her what exactly he had been talking to her about in the living room while they were looking at the painting. I wasn't comfortable with the way he was always hovering around her, and I wanted to know if he had crossed any lines again. My wife shrugged and told me that he had once again brought up the idea of painting her. Apparently, he was desperate for models, and according to him, his wife was too jealous to let him work with other women. That sounded about right. The guy was always looking for an excuse to get closer to my wife, and it was starting to get on my nerves. She mentioned that he had even gone on to talk about his studio, which he had set up in the attic of their house, and how his wife had paid for everything. It all seemed a bit pathetic to me, but I kept my thoughts to myself for the moment. I did, however, voice one thing that had been nagging at me. I asked her what she thought about his wife paying for everything, and whether she thought that was normal. I made it clear that if it were me, I wouldn't have put up with that kind of arrangement. I believed a man should be able to stand on his own 2 feet and not rely on his partner for everything. My wife rolled her eyes at me, clearly not in the mood for that kind of conversation. She let out an exasperated sigh and said that my comments were starting to cross the line into outright insults. She didn't want to hear me criticizing their relationship or the choices they had made. I could tell that this was a topic that was better left alone for now, so I decided to move on, even though I still had my reservations. Then she dropped another piece of news on me. Apparently, during their conversation, the gallery owner and her husband had invited us over to their house sometime soon. They wanted to show us the studio, give us a tour of their home, and just spend some more time together. I could hardly believe it. After everything that had happened, now we were supposed to go visit them? I wasn't sure how I felt about spending even more time with that guy, but I could tell that my wife was already interested in the idea. She seemed to think it would be fun to see their place and to get a better understanding of how they lived. I wasn't exactly thrilled, but I also didn't want to outright refuse and end up in another argument. I told her that I wasn't sure if I'd be able to make it. I reminded her that I had plans with my dad and some friends to help him finish building the veranda at his place. It was something we'd been working on for a while, and it would be good to get it done so that we could all enjoy it together. I said that it might be better for her to go without me if she was really set on going. I could see a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, but she nodded after a moment and said that she'd go on her own. She didn't seem too bothered by it, which was a relief. I didn't want her to feel like I was abandoning her, but I also didn't want to put myself in a situation where I had to spend more time around that guy than absolutely necessary. I then made it clear that I was fine with her going, especially since the gallery owner would be there as well. I trusted my wife, but I still didn't trust that guy. I figured as long as his wife was there, he wouldn't try anything. My wife seemed satisfied with that, and she gave me a smile, saying that it would be fine and that it might even be a fun experience. I wasn't so sure about the fun part, but I kept that to myself. I knew that she was looking forward to it, and I wasn't about to ruin that for her. So, I just nodded and told her to go ahead, that I would be busy with the veranda, and that we'd catch up afterward. She smiled again, and with that, we both settled in for the night, with the understanding that she'd be visiting them soon, and I'd be there to hear all about it once she got back. The day my wife left to visit the gallery owner and her husband, I took the opportunity to head over to my father's place with a few friends. We had planned to finish the veranda we'd been building for a while, and it was the perfect distraction to keep my mind off what was going on with her visit. We spent the morning hauling materials, hammering nails, and sharing stories, just the kind of honest, hard work that always felt good. At some point during a break, the conversation naturally shifted to what was going on with that artist guy. One of my friends brought it up, saying it was strange how the guy kept insisting on painting my wife. It was weird, no doubt about it. My dad shook his head, chiming in that he didn't understand why the guy wouldn't just paint his own wife if he was so desperate for a model. That was the question that had been bothering me too, but I didn't have an answer. I told them that I didn't know what his deal was, but one thing was certain, if he crossed any lines, I wouldn't hesitate to deal with him. I wasn't interested in playing games or being polite if it came to protecting my wife and my home. My dad nodded in agreement, and so did my friends. We all knew the type of guy he was, someone who thought he could do whatever he wanted just because he called himself an artist. I wasn't going to let that slide if it got out of hand. After we finished the veranda, we sat back and admired our work. It was a solid job, and it felt good to get something done with my own 2 hands. But even as we sat there, I couldn't completely shake the thoughts of what might be happening at that guy's house. By the time I got home, it was already late afternoon. My wife was there waiting for me, and she looked excited to share everything about her visit. She started talking right away, telling me about their house, how impressive it was, and how amazing the studio was that he had set up in the attic. She seemed genuinely enthusiastic about everything she had seen, and for a moment, I tried to just listen and let her enjoy sharing her experience. But then she mentioned that the guy had once again brought up painting her. Apparently, he hadn't let it go and was still pushing the idea, saying how much he needed models and how it would be perfect. My patience had already been running thin when it came to this guy, and hearing this again was the last straw. I didn't hold back. I told her straight out that I was putting an end to this nonsense. I made it clear that I didn't want her interacting with him anymore, at least not alone. If his wife was present, then fine, but I wasn't about to let him keep pursuing this so-called artistic interest in my wife. She looked at me, obviously not happy with what I was saying. Her expression shifted from surprise to anger, and she started arguing, saying that I was being unreasonable. She said that it wasn't normal for me to try to control who she could and couldn't talk to, and that my attitude was making things worse. But I wasn't in the mood to back down. This wasn't just about some casual conversation, it was about boundaries and respect, and that guy clearly didn't understand either. I told her that his obsession with painting other men's wives, especially nude, wasn't normal, no matter how he tried to spin it. I pointed out that his own wife was a model, for crying out loud, he had someone right there who he could paint all he wanted. But instead, he was fixated on my wife, and I wasn't about to tolerate that. My wife looked frustrated, accusing me of being controlling and saying that I was playing the same old tune of being an abuser just because I was standing my ground. She threw that word around, but I knew better. I wasn't abusing anyone, I was protecting what was mine, and I wasn't going to let anyone, especially some wannabe artist, cross the line. She kept arguing, but I stood firm. I told her that I had said all I needed to say. She could call it what she wanted, but I wasn't going to budge. My decision was final, no more interaction with the guy unless his wife was present, and no more entertaining his ridiculous requests. I wasn't going to let this situation spiral out of control, and I certainly wasn't going to let that guy think he could walk all over me or disrespect my marriage. My wife eventually fell silent, clearly upset, but I wasn't about to apologize. I looked her straight in the eye and told her again, I had said everything I needed to say, and that was the end of it. Over the next few weeks, I started to notice a change in my wife's routine. She began leaving the house more often, and her return times became increasingly unpredictable. At first, I didn't think much of it. She would say she was meeting up with friends or going out for a walk, and I figured she just needed some time to herself. But it started happening more frequently, and each time she returned, it seemed like she had less and less to say about what she'd been doing. When I asked her about her day, her answers were vague, as if she was trying to avoid giving me any real details. It wasn't like her to be so elusive, and I couldn't help but feel like something was off. One afternoon, she came back home with a noticeable stain on her white handbag. It was a splotch of paint, bright enough that it caught my eye immediately. I asked her what had happened, and she casually brushed it off, saying she had brushed against a freshly painted fence while she was out. She made it sound like it was no big deal, but something about her tone didn't sit right with me. It felt like she was trying too hard to make it seem like nothing out of the ordinary had happened. My gut told me there was more to the story, but I decided not to press her right away. Instead, I made a mental note to keep an even closer eye on what was going on. As the days went by, my suspicions only grew. The excuses she gave for her absences became even more flimsy, meeting up with a friend, running errands, going for a drive. It all sounded innocent enough, but there was something in the way she said it that made me doubt her. I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't being honest with me, and my thoughts kept drifting back to that artist. I wondered if she was seeing him behind my back, despite everything I had told her. The idea of it made my blood boil, and I knew I couldn't just sit back and ignore it. I confronted her one evening, telling her straight out that if I found out she was sneaking around with that guy, there would be serious consequences. I wasn't about to let anyone make a fool out of me. She rolled her eyes at me, clearly annoyed by my accusations. She called me an idiot and told me that I was being paranoid. She said that she wasn't doing anything wrong, and that I needed to stop acting like some kind of detective. I could feel the anger building inside me, but I tried to stay calm. I told her that I had every right to be concerned, given everything that had happened with that guy. I reminded her of how he had been pushing to paint her, and how he had been acting ever since we met him. She brushed it all off, saying that he was just an artist and that I was blowing everything out of proportion. But I wasn't convinced. I knew there was more going on, and I wasn't going to let it slide until I got to the bottom of it. Then, almost as if to justify her behavior, she brought up the fact that he had offered her money to pose for a portrait. She said that he had been willing to pay her around $1,000, and she made it sound like it was a missed opportunity. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I asked her if it was his money or his wife's money that he was planning on using. She looked at me with exasperation, as if I was the one being unreasonable. She said it didn't matter whose money it was, and that the opportunity was gone now anyway, so there was no point in dwelling on it. I could tell she was getting tired of the conversation, and she clearly wanted to move on. She repeated that it didn't matter, and that we should just forget about it. She seemed irritated that I was even questioning her about it, as if I had no right to be concerned. But I couldn't help myself. I needed to know what was really going on, and I wasn't about to let her dismiss my question so easily. She finally ended the conversation by saying that we had already missed the chance, and there was no point in talking about it anymore. She wanted to let it go and move forward, but I wasn't sure if I could do the same. I knew there was more beneath the surface, and until I got the truth, I wasn't going to let my guard down. One evening, while my wife was out yet again, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I picked it up anyway. To my surprise, it was the gallery owner, the wife of that artist. She sounded hesitant, as if she wasn't entirely sure if she should be calling me. She started by saying that she didn't want to jump to conclusions or accuse anyone unfairly, but she had noticed something strange with her husband lately. He had been disappearing from home more frequently, and she knew that he didn't have many friends or acquaintances to be spending time with. There was a tension in her voice, and I could tell she was genuinely concerned. She asked me, almost hesitantly, if I knew where my wife was. I felt my stomach drop. I told her that my wife had also been leaving the house a lot recently, and I had no real idea of where she was going or what she was doing. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, followed by a heavy sigh. The gallery owner then suggested something that caught me off guard. She said that, strange as it might sound, we should work together to find out what was really going on with our partners. She proposed that I keep an eye on my wife, and she would do the same for her husband, and we could share what we found out. I could hear the nervousness in her voice as she spoke, and I could tell that this was not an easy thing for her to suggest. She admitted that it felt strange to be asking for my help, but she was desperate to understand what her husband was up to. And, to be honest, I felt the same way. Something wasn't adding up, and it seemed like the only way to get to the bottom of it was by working together. I paused for a moment, then asked her why she was even bothering with a husband like that if she had so many doubts about him. Her voice grew quiet, and she said that was a conversation for another time. She hinted that there were things in her marriage that were complicated, and maybe one day she would tell me more, but for now, she just wanted to focus on figuring out what was going on. I could hear the vulnerability in her voice, and it was clear that she was struggling. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I agreed to her plan. We both wanted answers, and if this was the only way to get them, then so be it. We decided that we would keep an eye on our respective spouses and touch base in a few days to compare notes. After I hung up, I sat there for a while, trying to process everything. The idea that my wife might be sneaking around with that guy was like a punch to the gut, but at the same time, it wasn't entirely unexpected. There had been too many red flags lately, too many unanswered questions, too many suspicious details. I needed to know the truth, and if working with his wife was what it took, then I was willing to do it. I decided to start by checking my wife's laptop. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but I felt like I didn't have a choice. I opened it up and started looking through her files and browser history, hoping to find something that would either confirm or ease my suspicions. But there was nothing. No messages, no emails, nothing that gave me any clue as to what she was doing. Later that night, when my wife finally came home, I waited for her to fall asleep before I tried again. This time, I went through her phone. I scrolled through her messages, her call log, even her social media apps, but once again, I came up empty-handed. There wasn't even a contact for the artist in her phone. It was almost as if she had gone out of her way to cover her tracks. I couldn't decide if that made me feel better or worse. On one hand, I hadn't found any direct evidence of her cheating. But on the other hand, the lack of anything at all made me even more suspicious. It felt like she was hiding something, and I was no closer to finding out what it was. Eventually, I put her phone back and lay down beside her. My mind was racing, and sleep felt like a distant possibility. I kept thinking about everything that had happened, the paint stain on her bag, the late-night outings, the vague excuses. It all pointed to something, but I still didn't have the full picture. I knew I needed to talk to the gallery owner again, to see if she had found anything on her end. Maybe between the two of us, we could piece it all together. But that would have to wait until morning. For now, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm my thoughts enough to get some rest. I knew that tomorrow was going to be another long day, and I needed to be ready for whatever came next. The next morning, I called the gallery owner, my mind still buzzing from everything that had happened the night before. As soon as she picked up, I could hear that she was crying. Her voice was shaky, and I asked her what was going on, hoping it wasn't as bad as I feared. She took a deep breath before telling me that she had found something disturbing. She explained that she had discovered a portrait of my wife, nude, hidden in their studio. It wasn't just that, she had also come across a professional camera with footage that showed my wife and her husband together, confirming what I had dreaded the most. My stomach turned as I listened, the reality of the situation hitting me like a ton of bricks. She told me that she wasn't going to let this slide and asked if I could come over so that we could talk about what to do next. I agreed, and within an hour, I was at her place. She let me in, and we sat down in her living room, the air thick with tension and sadness. She started to open up about her relationship with her husband. She admitted that, initially, she had only married him because he was useful to her gallery. He was a talented artist, and having him on board gave her gallery credibility and brought in customers. But over time, she had grown attached to him. She confessed that, despite everything, she had fallen deeply in love with him, and now she felt utterly betrayed. Her tears were genuine, and I could see how much pain she was in. It was a strange feeling. On one hand, I was angry and hurt, but on the other, I couldn't help but feel a certain camaraderie with her. We were both victims of their betrayal. We sat there for a while, talking about our options. She made it clear that she wanted revenge, something that would make both of them pay for what they had done. I felt the same way. There was no way I was just going to let this slide without consequences. We brainstormed different ideas, and one of the first things she suggested was to ruin his career. She said she had connections with art critics and influencers, and she could easily spread negative reviews about his work. It sounded like a good plan, but I felt like it wasn't enough. Sure, ruining his career would hurt him, but it wouldn't be immediate or personal enough for my taste. I wanted something that would strike at the core of both of them, something they wouldn't be able to forget. That's when I got an idea. I reminded her that my wife's birthday was coming up soon. I proposed that we use it as an opportunity to get our revenge in a more direct and impactful way. My plan was simple, yet radical. I would invite my wife and her lover to her birthday celebration, make it seem like everything was fine, and then, when the time was right, I would sleep with the gallery owner's wife right there, during the party. It was extreme, but it felt like the only way to truly make them understand the depth of the betrayal and humiliation they had inflicted on us. I wanted them to feel the same sense of shock and pain that we were feeling now. I expected her to hesitate, maybe even to back out. After all, it was a drastic plan, and it required her to play an active role in something that could easily blow up in our faces. But to my surprise, she agreed. She looked me in the eyes, her face still stained with tears, and nodded. She said that she was willing to do whatever it took to make them pay for what they had done. She wanted them to experience the same hurt and humiliation that we were going through. In that moment, I realized just how determined she was to get her revenge, and I knew that we were in this together, no matter how messy it got. The day of my wife's birthday finally arrived. I had been waiting for this day, my mind filled with the plan we had made. I kept my demeanor calm and collected, even offering my wife a bouquet of flowers in the morning, wishing her a happy birthday. She smiled, seemingly unaware of what was to come. I told her that I had a special gift for her later in the evening, something that I wanted to surprise her with. She seemed genuinely pleased, and I watched as she went about her day, probably thinking that I had forgotten everything that had happened. Little did she know, this day would be one she would never forget. As evening fell, we had a small celebration at home. I acted like everything was perfectly normal. I prepared a nice dinner, and we sat together, eating and making small talk. I could tell she felt relaxed, believing that everything between us was getting back to normal. Just as we were finishing dinner, my phone buzzed. It was the gallery owner's wife, telling me that she was waiting by the front door. I felt a surge of adrenaline rush through me as I stood up and looked at my wife, telling her that her special gift had just arrived. She gave me a curious look, clearly not expecting anything, as I went to open the door. I opened the door, and there she was, the wife of the artist, standing there with a determined expression on her face. Without saying a word, she walked inside, and I led her to the living room where my wife was waiting. The gallery owner's wife dropped to her knees in front of me and began performing an intimate act, right there in front of my wife. My wife's expression turned from confusion to sheer disbelief, and then to rage. She started screaming, her voice filled with shock and anger, but I didn't flinch. I looked down at her and said, "This is for the video and that portrait." I wanted her to understand exactly why this was happening, to feel the same kind of betrayal that I had felt when I found out what she had done. My wife was in complete hysterics, her face flushed with anger as she began gathering her things. She yelled at both of us, her voice cracking as she accused us of being monsters, of ruining everything. But I didn't care. I was past the point of caring about anything she had to say. The gallery owner's wife didn't stop either. She was just as determined as I was to see this through, and we both ignored my wife's tantrum. Eventually, my wife stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her and screaming that we would both regret this. I watched her leave without any emotion, knowing that this was exactly the outcome I had wanted. There was no turning back now, and I was ready to face whatever came next. After my wife left, the gallery owner's wife and I continued with what we had started. We moved upstairs, and I could tell she was just as caught up in the moment as I was. There was no regret, no second thoughts. This was about revenge, about taking back control of our lives after everything that had been taken from us. We ended up in my bedroom, and what happened next was purely driven by the anger and betrayal we both felt. There was no love or tenderness, just a need to release everything that had been building up inside us for so long. It was raw, and it was exactly what we both needed in that moment. While we were together, she pulled out her phone and began recording. She made sure that her husband would see exactly what was happening, that he would understand the consequences of his actions. She even spoke directly to him, her voice dripping with spite as she taunted him, telling him that this was his fault, that this was what he had pushed her to do. I watched as she addressed the camera, her expression fierce and unyielding. I could almost picture the look on his face when he would eventually see the video. It was exactly what I wanted, to see him brought down, to make him feel the same helplessness that I had felt. Later, after everything had calmed down, we lay there in silence, both of us knowing that we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. There was no regret, though. We had both gotten what we wanted, revenge, and a sense of closure, however twisted it might have been. She told me that she was going to send the video to her husband, and I nodded, knowing that this was just another step in our plan. She did exactly that, recording a few more words to him before hitting send. The satisfaction on her face was undeniable, and I felt the same way. When he saw the video, I knew it would destroy him, and that was exactly what we both wanted. The gallery owner's wife had taken back control, and so had I. There was no going back, and we were both prepared to face the fallout. Later, she even stayed the night, and we ended up together again. This time, she made sure to record another message for her husband, ensuring that he would get the message loud and clear. The price of his betrayal was far higher than he could have imagined. In the weeks that followed, I began the process of filing for divorce. There was no going back now, and I wanted to make sure everything was done properly. I worked closely with my attorney, preparing all the necessary documents and ensuring that every detail was accounted for. It wasn't easy, but it was a necessary step toward moving forward. The first part of our plan had gone off without a hitch, and now it was time to focus on the second part. The gallery owner's wife was instrumental in making this happen. She had a wide network of contacts, including several well-known art critics. It didn't take long before her connection started to work their magic, and the results were exactly what we had hoped for. The artist's work became the target of scathing reviews, and his reputation took a nosedive. One critic after another ripped into his latest exhibitions, calling his work derivative and uninspired. The buzz spread quickly, and soon enough, he was the laughingstock of the art community. The gallery owner's wife had pulled every string she could, and the impact was devastating. He lost his credibility, and the very people who had once praised his work now ridiculed it. He was no longer seen as an up-and-coming talent, but rather as a joke. It was almost unbelievable how quickly it all fell apart for him, but it was exactly what we wanted. Watching his career crumble was the revenge we had planned, and it felt like a victory. As the divorce proceedings moved forward, I kept my focus on what mattered most, cutting ties with my wife and leaving this mess behind me. Eventually, the divorce was finalized. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, and I was finally free to move on with my life. Interestingly enough, I found myself growing closer to the gallery owner. The bond we had formed through our shared experience of betrayal had only strengthened over time, and eventually, we decided to take a chance on each other. It wasn't something I had expected, but it felt right. She understood me in a way that no one else could, and we both wanted to move forward together, leaving the past behind us. Meanwhile, my ex-wife tried to salvage her relationship with the artist, but it was clear that things weren't going well for them. She hadn't anticipated the full extent of the fallout from the criticism his work had received. His reputation was in tatters, and the art world had turned its back on him. He no longer had the connections or the respect that he had once enjoyed, and the financial stability he had relied on was gone too. The money he had been using to fund his lifestyle had always come from his wife, and now that his career was in ruins, there was nothing left to support him. The cracks in their relationship began to show, and it wasn't long before they started to drift apart. Eventually, my ex-wife and the artist ended things for good. It was almost poetic in a way. She had thrown everything away for him, and in the end, he couldn't give her what she wanted. She was left with nothing, while I had managed to move on and find something meaningful with someone who truly understood me. The gallery owner and I continued to see each other, and our relationship grew stronger with each passing day. We had both been through hell, but we had come out the other side with a sense of purpose and a determination to build something better for ourselves. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Looking back, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The plan we had put into motion had worked perfectly. The artist had been brought down, my ex-wife had faced the consequences of her actions, and I had found a way to move forward. It wasn't the life I had envisioned for myself, but it was a new beginning, and I was ready to embrace it. The gallery owner and I had both been broken by our pasts, but together we were stronger. We had taken control of our lives and created something new, something worth fighting for. And that was more than I could have hoped for when all of this had started.